This lecture is going to be on moral reform in women, and so I introduced moral reform in the last lecture, but I basically want to pick up on that and spend more time on moral reform, women and moral reform, because women are going to play a really important part in the moral reform movement in the United States. So moral reform time period in the United States, they definitely can say it can start 1815 and go into 1830 or 37 into 30s, but then there's like another wave, and you definitely see moral reform into 1860, right before the Civil War. So when you talk about 1840 to 1850, or I should say 1830s through 1850s, it becomes a time period of reform in America. It's basically people in the United States want to make life better in America. And women are going to play a huge role in reforming America or the reform movements in the United States. Women were seen as moral guardians within their families and within their communities. And so this idea of women being kind of like the moral guardians on a small scale is definitely seen that can be used in a large scale. And so women are definitely going to take this, in a sense, responsibility to a large scale when women are going to get involved in their communities and really try to make a difference within their communities. Some women will actually write about their responsibilities and their responsibilities of a woman, and the responsibilities not only in the home, but then also in the communities. A book that we talked about in the last lecture, Goodies or Goddy's Ladies Book, you will see a lot of articles writing about how women should be the moral keepers of the home and family, and then that translates to, in a sense, moral keepers in the community. And then also, you can see it from a smaller scale as being like the moral reform people of the household and raising good children. But then if you look at it from a larger scale, if you raise good children, then that's going to translate into putting people out into society, and basically good people out into society. So that's kind of that jump of women influencing the community. Okay. Okay, this is kind of something we had already talked about. From their responsibilities at home, women are definitely looking at trying to deal with the problems in society, and many of them feeling that they had a responsibility to improve society, and that women, and I should say women that are doing it are going to be middle class and above. So the women that are going to be involved in this movement is definitely going to be middle class and above, since they're going to have the time and the time to do all these things. So you'll definitely see women making an influence within their churches, because they're definitely making sure that their family goes to church, but they're definitely going to be involved in church organizations and auxiliaries coming from the churches. And it will be really good for women because it teaches women organizational skills, working with others, how to get like a large project done, working with others, and that goes back to that organization skill. And so it's not that they don't know how to organize a household, it's just kind of using those skills and putting them on a larger scale. So what are the issues? What are the reform issues of this time period? And I will say there is a slide on the PowerPoint listing all the moral reform issues. So one issue is definitely going to be education. There's going to be a big push for women to get better education. Now that started with Republican motherhood. Okay, so that started a little while ago, but there's still this continual push for women to just have better education, and it's happening. It's one of those slow, gradual processes. A woman by the name of Harriet Beecher will write that schools should focus on teacher training. Teacher training schools at this point in time are called normal schools, and I will be very honest, I don't know the reason for the name, but a teaching training program would be referred to as a normal school. Almira Phelps pressed for schools that included science, and she and her husband will open, it's called PAPSICO Female Institute in Baltimore. PAPSICO, and it's PATAPSCO, PAPSICO Female Institute in Baltimore, and they definitely taught science in their classes. Okay, African American education. There's definitely going to be a movement to educate free African Americans. There's already been a little bit of a movement up in the north, and so you will see a movement, right, to educate and offer education to African Americans. Your Quakers or the Society of Friends will definitely be involved in that. They'll be opening up a fair amount of schools to educate African Americans. One example is going to be known as the Institute for Colored Youth in Philadelphia. You're going to have a woman by the name of Grace Mapps, M-A-P-P-S. Grace Mapps, African American, taught here. Her daughter, Sarah Mapp, will also teach there. Now, the Institute for Colored Youth in Philadelphia is now what we know as Cheyney University of Pennsylvania. So it's actually still going, just definitely a different name, and definitely has expanded over the years. All right, another woman, Fanny Coppin, C-O-P-P-I-N, also taught at the Institute for Colored Youth in Philadelphia. Fanny Coppin was born a slave. She purchased her freedom. She became literate. She became educated. She went to Rhode Island State Normal School, a teaching training program. After that, she went to Oberlin College. And then after that, she became principal, or she started to teach at the Institute for Colored Youth, and then will eventually become principal of the Institute for Colored Youth in Philadelphia. Okay, now another reform movement. Another reform movement would be family size. And it's the idea of trying to decrease family size in the United States. Some women tried to be outspoken about limiting family size, but still, this is something that it's a subject that you would definitely speak about, and you would speak about behind closed doors. This is not something that you would speak about in public. Although some women are tending to be a little bit more outspoken, they have to do so very carefully because they're definitely going against society by talking about this subject. So anyway, what are they trying to do? They're trying to find information. They're trying to gather information, basically on contraceptions and abortions. When you talk about family size in this time period, family size does go down. Family size is going to go from about 7 kids to about, and I know it's a crazy number, 5.4. So let's just call it 7 to 5 kids, but it's definitely decreasing. So when you're looking about 1850, the average family is having about 5 kids. And so family size is decreasing, but for some women, they would actually like to decrease it even more. There's definitely a lot of opposition to this, especially religious or a religious community would have a great opposition to this. Okay, another reform movement would be medicine. There's definitely a push for improvement in medicine, just overall in general across the board, but there's also a push for improvement in OBGYN, basically obstetrics and gynecology care, basically care for women. And it's a subject, once again, that you really don't talk about. You're going to have a woman by the name of Elizabeth Blackwell. This is 1849. Elizabeth Blackwell wants to become a doctor. And this is a whole nother thing. Elizabeth Blackwell is challenging education because she wants more education. She wants to be a doctor. She's challenging society because in the United States, men are doctors. So she's challenging a lot of things. But Elizabeth Blackwell is going to actually challenge to get into medical school. She will actually be accepted in Geneva College, and this is in New York. And it's a little bit of a story. The school did not want to admit her, but they also thought that she would fail. And so they admitted her to basically prove a lesson that she would fail. But the problem is she didn't fail. She didn't fail medical school. And they also tried to prohibit her from going to certain classes. One of the classes that she was prohibited from going to was anatomy class. And that was because they talked about male anatomy, and a woman shouldn't be in that type of lecture. But she basically found a way around the system. She actually passed, and she became the first woman medical doctor in the United States. But even though she became a doctor, she actually couldn't practice because nobody would hire her, and she, in a sense, couldn't support herself as a doctor in the United States. And so she will actually have to go to Europe. She will practice in London, in Paris, and then she wants to come back home, and she'll eventually return in New York City. And once again, she couldn't find a job. So she'll open up her own clinic. This is in 1871. She'll have her own clinic, and it's basically for women. She'll open up what's known as an infirmary in New York City, and she'll also open up a college for women, and it's known as the National Health Society. From then on, she will actually do a huge amount of studying on the subject of gynecology, and she will lecture extensively about gynecology. She will actually write books on the subject, and she really opens up the field, and she's actually credited with opening up the field of gynecology. All right, education. Still on education. Women definitely show a huge interest in learning more and like learning the sciences. Science being taught in the various schools was very hit and miss. That's why you had Admira Phillips and her husband really trying to push the issue. One of the sciences that was allowed for women to take was botany. And you actually see a lot of women going into botany because that's really about the only science they could get, which is frustrating for them, but they kind of got to take what they can get and slowly push the boundaries. Okay, another reform movement would be religion. When you talk about Protestant religions, and that's the predominant religion in the United States, is the various Protestant religions. Over time, women are becoming more involved within the churches. They're running like Bible studies, or just kind of like auxiliary things or things off to the side. They're not giving the sermons, anything like that, but they definitely are encouraged to participate in religion. So that's definitely a very positive thing. The Congregational Church will allow women to become ministers in 1853. And this is definitely very, in a sense, kind of radical at this point in time. But you'll also see women play roles in other kind of like smaller religions, which are known as sects at this point in time. And you tend to see them going in that direction because they're allowed to do more in kind of these smaller religious communities. A good example, we've already talked about that, is the Shakers. The Shakers was a Protestant sect created by a woman, and women definitely went into the Shaker community. Now, there's also going to be what's known as the Utopian societies. Some of them have a little bit of religion base. Some of them really don't have a religion base. But you definitely see women going into utopian societies because utopian societies are different than what's going on in everyday society. And it allows women to do more and have more freedoms. And so that makes sense of why they would kind of turn to these communities. Okay, the first, and you could put in the Shakers as a utopian society. Okay, another one we were going to talk about is Brooks Farm, started in Boston. This is 1841, created by Margaret Fuller. She helped plan the communities. All members worked together to get life and work done on Brooks Farms. And basically there was women and men did all different types of chores. So there was a little bit of division of labor, but everybody basically worked together to get stuff done. and everybody was paid the same rate. Women were seen as equals, treated as equals. Women could vote in community issues, and they also held positions of authority. All right, another community would be the Oneida community. This is upstate New York. Started around 1848. Now, the Oneida community would be a little bit different, and it's definitely a communal type of living. The Oneida community is a communal type of living. They believe that everybody is married to everyone else. Once you join the Oneida community, it's like you automatically become married to everybody else. Okay, and you do everything as a community. So the workload is divided, and so it's a very communal way of life. Now, yes, I know there are going to be hookups. I fully understand that there's going to be hookups, and you will have children that will be born into this community. And yes, of course, when a baby is a brand new baby, of course, mom is taking care of it. Mom and dad are taking care of it. But once the baby gets a little bit older, the community feels it's their responsibility also to raise the child. So the child is raised in a very communal type of lifestyle. Also, when you talk about all of these communities, and you can add in the Shakers, the Brooks Farms, Oneida, the women basically have equality in these communities, and it makes it more attractive for women to have that equality, because that's definitely something that they're yearning for in society. Okay, now moving on to other reform societies. Okay, these are known as benevolent societies, and benevolent societies are kind of like, it's an overall kind of big picture of kind of like moral reform societies. It's basically how can you benefit society, and it can be in all different ways. And these are a lot of like organizations that are formed, and women are going to be involved in all different things. It's what interests them, what they find to be important. You will have, and I'm going to give you some examples of benevolent societies. The Newark Female Charitable Society, that basically dealt with the poor community in the Newark area. You have the Boston Seamen's Aid Society. The Boston Seamen's Aid Society, that was a society that basically took care of the widows of fishermen. And back then, you definitely had a lot of deaths. Fishermen can have a lot of accidents and drownings and boats that go under. And so it left a lot of widows. And so the Boston Seamen's Aid Society basically raised money for the widows of those fishermen that had passed away. You have the Providence Employment Society. The Providence Employment Society kind of helped out the poor, but it really started focusing on seamstresses. And sometimes you weren't making a whole lot of money as a seamstress, and it was basically a way to help them out. But as it grew, it was basically kind of helping out the poor. Okay, other societies, the African Dorcas Society. The African Dorcas Society, and it's DORCUS society, basically aided school children, African American school children. It basically was able to buy them supplies and clothing to help them in school. Another one would be the Union Anti-Slavery Society. This is in Rochester, New York. The Union Anti-Slavery Society in Rochester, New York. And it was basically fundraising for the anti-slavery movement. It was just an anti-slavery society. Okay, so those are just kind of some overall benevolent societies, just organizations that are basically in some way, shape, or form trying to help society. Okay, now there are definitely other reform movements. Another one is going to be prison and asylum reform. And it's basically trying to make prisons and asylums a little more tolerable, a little bit more humane. Now, one of the leading members or leading woman in this organization is going to be Dorothea Dix, D-I-X. Dorothea Dix will kind of make it a little bit of her life's passion to basically clean up the prisons and asylums. Now, before I get into that, I want to make one mention before I forget. There's going to be a push to have separate women's prisons instead of putting women with men or kind of trying to divide them into in one prison. The first one will be in Mount Pleasant, New York. But overall, a lot of times what you'll see is women and men being in the same prison, just separated. Okay. Getting back to Dorothea Dix. Dorothea Dix is going to get, she really does life work trying to clean up prisons and asylums. Now, asylums are mental institutions. Asylums, one sec, my cat's jumping up, sorry. Sorry about that. Okay, asylums, mental asylums, mental institutions. Mental institutions, or asylums as they were called back then, is basically something that you don't talk about. Mental illness is something that you don't talk about. And you basically put a person who has mental illness into an asylum, and a lot of times, in a sense, you kind of almost, it's kind of sad. You kind of forget about them. The people don't go to visit them very much. You don't talk about them. And many people go into asylums and will basically die at an asylum. Okay, but you also have to remember mental illness is different back then because we don't have drugs, we don't have treatments, we don't really know how to deal with mental illness. And some mental illnesses are probably pretty mild, but it can also then go to the other spectrum where you have mental illness where people are absolutely out of control and they actually don't know how to treat that. And so anyway, asylums. So anyway, what Dorothea Dix wants to do is she wants to make prisons and asylums more humane. And so what she will go in, she'll tour them, she'll start touring them, and she realizes that it's just basic necessities. Her thing is that people should be fed 3 times a day, both the institutions, and that where they live and where they reside, because most people are residing in cells, even in the asylums, and those cells should be clean, and they should be cleaned every day, and that's not always happening. Okay, and another thing she'll say is that people should be able to get out of their cells, even if it's for like an hour or two, and just like walk around and basically be in the fresh air. And that's what she is promoting within the asylums, in the prison and asylums. It's the beginning of it, and she definitely will make changes. Is it everywhere in every institution and every prison and every asylum? No. But you basically have to start somewhere, and you kind of got to start making ground a little bit here and there and hope that'll kind of take off. So it's her way of trying to clean up. Now, another reform movement is going to be the temperance movement. The temperance movement, as I mentioned in the last lecture, has been around since like the 1700s. There tends to be the second wave. I would say 1815s definitely into kind of 1860 before the Civil War. The temperance movement is basically getting rid of alcohol, getting rid of the consumption, the making of it, and the selling of it. You're going to have a lot of different organizations. You're going to have the Daughters of Temperance. You'll have the Women's Temperance Movement. You also have the American Temperance Society. And so all various different temperance movements, all just in the same direction of trying to get rid of alcohol. At this point in time, nothing really comes from it, but what they're doing is they're laying the groundwork, because the temperance movement is going to pick up again later, basically after the Civil War. And so they're basically laying the groundwork for it, and it's something they just pick up after the Civil War. Okay, now, I believe the last reform movement for this lecture I want to talk about is the abolitionist and the anti-slavery movement. Okay, now remember, abolitionists want to end slavery today, and the anti-slavery people are okay with doing it in steps, so long for both groups. Basically, the end result is going to be the same as that, getting rid of slavery. Now, as the years go by, there is definitely a growing number of people who are starting to join and follow the abolitionist and the anti-slavery movement and are really starting to press the issue. Yes, definitely more so in the North and more so in the West. When you talk, another thing. Oh, I know where I wanted to go. When you talk about the both movement, abolitionist, anti-slavery movement, they're definitely going to be made up of people of both black and white. So it's not just for one community. You will definitely have both black and white that are following both of them. Now, women are definitely going to be a large part of both movements. Okay, so one I want to start off with is going to be 1832. You have in Salem, Massachusetts, is the first female abolitionist society. It was both black and white. And then after the creation of this first female abolitionist movement in Salem, Massachusetts, you will see other ones that will pop up. They'll pop up in Boston, Rochester, New York, New York City, Philadelphia. So they'll start to basically pop up after that. The Quaker community in Philadelphia, well, the Quaker community in Pennsylvania, you tend to talk about in Philadelphia, they tend to be the most active, very strong abolitionist movement and society there. And you see a lot of activists at this point in time either be in Philadelphia or come from Philadelphia. That tends to be a hub at this point in time for the abolitionist movement. The Forten family, F-O-R-T-E-N. The Forten family is a free African-American society, and they have daughters. The husband and wife, the family that they have will have daughters, and one of the big things for that family is education. Both the mom and dad were educated, and that was basically their focus was to make sure that the daughters were educated and college educated. So when you talk about the Forten family, you have Sarah, Harriet, and Margaretta, and they're all going to be out of Philadelphia. They will all be a part of the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. All the women will be speaking and writing about the anti-slavery movement. And they call it the anti-slavery movement. The Fortens definitely tend to be abolitionists. So every once in a while, they use the words kind of interchangeably back then. Okay, now another woman we have to talk about is going to be Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was a runaway slave, and she will run away into the North, and she will she becomes a free slave, or lives a life of a free slave. She'll be in the North, and then she'll eventually make it into Canada for a period of time. And then she comes back into the United States, and she hears about what's known as the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad is a very systematic, it's an organization, and it's a systematic way of basically going into the South, meeting up with slaves, and then taking them back into the North. And it's a very organized way of bringing slaves into the North. They have like key words or like code words, if you will, Underground Railroad. And people really don't know what that is, but it's really not underground. It's just a quiet way of doing it. The guides that go and get the slaves are known as conductors. It's that way that you can talk about it freely in society, and that way if there's anybody who doesn't believe in it, they really don't understand what they're saying. So it's a little way to kind of get around that. Now, Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman will be a part of the Underground Railroad. And she will be a conductor. She knows the Maryland, that's the area that she was a slave in, so she will work extensively about going into the Maryland area, a little bit into Virginia, it's mainly Maryland area, and she will basically be a conductor, and she will go and basically get slaves and bring them into the North. Harriet Tubman herself is credited with bringing in over 300 slaves to safety. She was known as Moses of her people. She was known to carry a firearm, but she was always very proud about the fact that she never lost anyone, meaning nobody ever got caught or, got, moved away from the group, basically lost from the group or got pulled away. And she also will say that she never had to use her firearm. So those were two things that she was very proud about. Now, Harriet Tubman herself being a runaway slave, it was actually very dangerous for her to be a conductor. If Harriet Tubman would have been caught, she actually had a price on her head, because people will or the Southerners will realize that she's doing it, and there will, for a time period, there will actually be a price on her head. But if she was to be caught, she would have been killed automatically. So it was very dangerous for Harriet Tubman to do it. But she will say it's basically her life's work. And she will also say that she's doing God's work. She feels very motivated spiritually to do this. And she kind of feels that like this is just her life's work and what God wants her to do. She's a very small woman. I don't know exactly how tall she is. I would just probably say around 5 feet. She looks very small and petite, probably, not much over 100 pounds. But man, she was a very strong woman. And so she will definitely be a very prominent member of the Underground Railroad. Now, another woman we have to talk about, Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth was a slave, and she will become free. And she is illiterate. She will never learn how to read and write. But what she will do is memorize the Bible. And she knows the Bible extremely well. She knows the Bible back and forth. And she can just like automatically like quote verses from the Bible. She will do, she's a Methodist, and she's very religious. She's Methodist. She'll do a lot of preaching. She'll do a lot of speaking. She'll speak for the abolitionist cause, but then she'll also speak basically kind of as a preacher and religious, but she'll also do a lot of speaking for the abolitionist cause. She was a very impassioned speaker, just a fabulous speaker. She could really get people motivated. So she spoke out greatly for the abolitionist cause. Other ladies we have to talk about, the Gremke sisters, Grimke. Gremke sisters, Angelina and Sarah. I believe I mentioned them briefly in the last lecture. Both girls, they're sisters, they're from South Carolina. They grew up in a very wealthy South Carolinian home that had a large plantation that had many slaves. And as children, they saw the problems of slavery. And they believed it was morally wrong. They grew up to actually hate slavery. And so when they could, and they're educated, okay, so both daughters are educated. When they got the chance, they will leave and go into the North, and they will actually go into Philadelphia. When they're in Philadelphia, they're a part of that anti-slavery abolitionist movement. They will do a huge amount of speaking for the abolitionist anti-slavery cause. They will do speaking and writing for the abolitionist cause. Their writings and speeches are very aggressive to push the movement. And with their writings and their speaking, they will then also start to speak out for women's rights. And you tend to see this a lot. Those that speak for the abolitionist cause will then also start to speak for the women's right cause. Combined, the women will write over 30 books. And they'll have and they basically are dealing with the abolitionist cause or the women's rights issues. Another woman we have to talk about is Harriet Beecher Stowe. Harriet Beecher Stowe will be a prolific writer. She did a huge amount of writing. She will write several books on the anti-slavery cause. One of the best known of her books is Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin was published in 1842. I believe that there is a slide on Uncle Tom's Cabin and Harriet Beecher Stowe. And the thing with Uncle Tom's Cabin is it depicted the life of a slave. And in a novel, okay, this is the first time you will see that done. It's written from the view of slavery. And at this point in time, people aren't writing about it from the view of slavery in a novel, like in a book, okay? Now, the reason why I say this is because Harriet Beecher Stowe is a good friend of William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison is a newspaper man. He is an abolitionist. He has the Liberator newspaper. Within the Liberator newspaper, William Garrison will always say, write about the life of a slave. Don't talk about the problems on slavery on society, basically show the horrible life of a slave. Harriet Beecher Stowe, being friends with him, will understand that concept, and she takes that concept and she writes it in book form, in a novel form. So there are books about slavery that are written, but this is the first time that it's written from a slave's point of view, which will definitely have a huge impact on society. It's more relatable to society. Okay, now, Uncle Tom's Cabin will be a bestseller. It was huge, absolutely huge. Harriet Beecher Stowe will go on to write a book called Dred, D-R-E-D, The Tale of the Great Dismal Swamp. That's published in 1856. She writes a second book. It's called Dred, D-R-E-D, A Tale of the Great Dismal Swamp, 1856. That book, same thing, written from the point of view of a slave. It's not well received. Okay, so you don't really hear much about it. Uncle Tom's Cabin is huge because it's a bestseller, and for some people who are on the fence about slavery, it pushes them to the side of anti-slavery. Actually, Uncle Tom's Cabin is going to be credited with causing more tension in the United States about the pro-anti-slavery situation in the United States. So that's the impact that the book is going to have. And in actuality, Uncle Tom's Cabin is going to be propaganda for the anti-slavery movement. And that's really how it's seen in society. And if you look back historically, that is how it's seen in society. So huge, absolutely huge, written by a woman. All right, now I want to mention briefly, because I'm going to go into it in a little bit more detail in the next lecture, but as I mentioned, women who are a part of the abolitionist cause tend to also be about the women's rights movement. And so this is also going to be another reform movement, is the women's rights movement. Women are starting to find their voice. And they're starting to, a lot of them are finding their voice through the anti-slavery movement. They're finding their voice. They realize they don't have any rights. They can't vote. They really can't do anything. And so you're going to see this women's rights movement come about, I would say it starts in the 1830s. I think it was kind of there a little bit, 1820s. It was actually there in the 1817s, but nobody really was listening. Okay, so you have Abigail Adams, Judith Starr Murray talking about, but nobody really was listening. People start listening in the 1800s, and then there's going to be this wave starting in the 1830s, and people are listening. 1850s, people are listening. Many women, as I mentioned, were a part of the abolitionist movement, but what's happening is that Angelina Grumke is going to state it best. She will say, the investigation of the rights of slaves led me to a better understanding of my own. And they realize that everything they talk about a slave basically refers to them. The slaves have no right and women have no rights. And so that's how you get this correlation. Now, so women like the Grumke sisters, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Harriet Beecher Stowe will all be strong voices for the women's rights movement. There are many others, but you can see this connection. And many of the women that are a part of the women's rights movement are a part of the abolitionist movement. Now, other prominent women I'm just going to mention really quickly. Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Lucy Stone, all prominent members of the women's rights movement, and I will also say part of the abolitionist movement. So I'm going to end my lecture there, and I'm going to pick up on the women's rights movement in another lecture.